to get started.
Sure, yeah.
We're thrilled to have Steve Jackson join us for a CASCI talk today. So he is a colleague and associate professor at Cornell University in the ag school there. Is doing really cool work around repairs, and that's about today. So,
great, thank you. And thank you to Katie for setting this up. I'm very happy to visit. It's my first time to Maryland, and many people who I've known from past lives and sort of collaborative circumstances, and so it's really great to be here. Today's talk is going to be about sort of a broad area of work that I've been working on for several years now, really, so it's a bit of an overview talk. There's a few different papers I'll be kind of actually not referencing, but if you're interested in some of the longer sort of writing history or recent writing history around some of this stuff, a lot of it comes up here. Some of the broader ideas, there's sort of a conceptual part to the talk. It's kind of a theory, empirical theory sandwich is the organization of the talk. So I'm going to open up with some conceptual things about why I think maintenance and repair have been understudied to date in information and technology studies, but also, I would say, broader social sciences. And I'm going to talk about a few projects that try and kind of act on that assumption or that interpretation of the world. And I won't say anything more about them now because I will be talking about them soon. So the paper will open with some background and conceptual roots, why I think it's useful to approach the world of technology in this way. I'll talk about some ongoing studies, many of which are still in process. And I'm going to say a little bit at the end, kind of coming back to the initial stuff, about some hints and starting points for how we might think or rethink an ethics of repair, and what it would mean to actually make that our starting point when we think about technology and information. But before all that, and actually in some ways the main point, is just this simple observation that things fall apart, in the words of the great African novelist, Chinua Achebe. Bridges break. It's the Minnesota bridge that collapsed a few years ago, you might remember. So do rivers in their engineered form and the human worlds that are built around them. Cities can fail. This is an image of Detroit. Not all of Detroit looks like that, but pretty big chunks of Detroit actually look like that. So can the broader economies meant to support them. So this is actually a meeting of dispossessed GM pensioners around the time the economic meltdown was happening and the GM restructuring was happening, bankruptcy. And to bring things a little closer to sort of an information school world, it's true that the steady state of the technologies around us, including the ones we carefully design, study, and use in the information world today, is not this, kind of the sleek Apple, iPod story, but this. If you want to think about where technology lands over the long haul, it's this. It's not the Apple Store, it's this. Okay, so things fall apart. They do so regularly and with great transformative, and as I'll try and argue today, deeply human consequence. They also do so with great power, grace, and a certain uncanny beauty. And I'll show you a few images now from a photographic series that I love. I've written about a little bit and talked to people about before, so this may be familiar. This is the Shipbreaking series by Canadian photographer Edward Bertinsky. And it's all about, it follows the shipbreaking industry in Bangladesh. There's a separate series actually called Ship Recycling, which sort of follows what happens once these pieces sort of go back into the world. And the story of the shipbreaking industry essentially is that ocean liners are driven up onto the beaches in Bangladesh, and then teams of people with blowtorches and ropes take them apart. And nothing much more complicated than that. It's actually, this is how it's operating. You can find big chunks of the series online, and I encourage you to look at it. It's really an amazing series, I think. This is what happens with some of the oil and petroleum that remains. Okay, but here's the other side. So I've been telling you the things break story. Things also get put back together in ways that reflect and engage the very deep capacities for resilience, imagination, and care that characterize human life, towards ourselves, towards each other, and towards and in concert with the object worlds around us. This, in short, is the art of repair, the subtle acts of care and resilience by which order and meaning in complex socio-technical worlds are maintained and transformed. Human value is preserved and extended, and the complicated work of fitting to the varied circumstances of organizations, systems, and lives is accomplished. So repair, in the way that I'll be using it, has a very literal and immediate connotation. What are the actual acts of repair that people engage in to keep systems going, to keep objects alive and functioning in the world? But it also speaks directly to the social, and what you'll see in the talk is there's sort of this weaving back and forth between repair in its immediately technological guise, but then also a lot of the talk is actually inspired by work coming out of the social sciences and philosophy that looks at acts of human repair. I'll talk about that in a minute. So, who maintains the infrastructures within and against which our lives unfold? But also this question about how human orders get broken and restored, and again, who does this work? And the who question is really important. There's a distributional element to this story that I want not to lose sight of. And the general sensibility, which a tagline I've been using, is this notion of broken world thinking as a way of kind of encapsulating some of these ideas. Okay, so this is the part of the talk that I most love talking about, and this is really sort of where the ideas come from in one trajectory. So there's actually a lot of different sorts of philosophical or kind of social theory trajectories that one could follow and still arrive, I think, at the end point of maintenance and repair. The particular one I'm going to talk about mostly comes out of the American pragmatist tradition. So one of my favorite theorists is John Dewey, and this book in particular is one of the books that first got me started thinking about the repair notion. There's an earlier piece actually that sort of Dewey, in 1897 he writes a book called The Reflex Arc in Psychology, which is one of the most important works in American psychology. It's the most cited work of the first part of the 20th century, up until the 1950s, I guess, in American psychology, in which he first starts to hint around these ideas, and then it really gets blown out in this book of human nature and conduct. And the thing I take from this book that connects back to repair is Dewey's theory of consciousness and his notion of habit and routine and consciousness. And the basic argument, to sort of simplify vastly, is that in human nature and conduct, Dewey argues that most of what we do most of the time is operate on habit and routine. 95% of what we do in the world involves no active conscious reflection at all. We just do what we do. We sort of go on, going on. The moment where consciousness starts, for Dewey, the moment where consciousness is triggered is the moment of breakdown, right? So we have a routine in the morning, we get up, we brush our teeth, we make a coffee. We never think about that routine. We've done it a million times. One day we get up, we're out of coffee. Now all of a sudden I'm thinking about coffee, probably in a somewhat panicked mode. And I think, oh, okay, well, where can I get coffee? I have to go to Starbucks or whatever. That's the moment of consciousness. So for Dewey, there's something really profound in the moment of breakdown, right? That moment where expectations are upset, when systems fail, is the moment that a lot of what we tend to privilege in the world of cognition or psychology begins, right? So this is one key point. I think this broad insight in Dewey gets picked up and extended in different ways by ethnomethodology, in particular Harold Garfinkel, studies in ethnomethodology. So for those of you who know Garfinkel, he's most famous for a series of what he called breaching experiments, which may or may not pass IRB review now. But his basic argument is that social order is this really complicated thing to study because when it's functioning, it's invisible, right? We just don't see it happening because we're like fish in water. Like ask a fish about water and they would say, what's that? It's because it's what we live in. So for Garfinkel, he says that the way you discover a social order, the way you can tell where social order operates and how it's organized is by breaching its conventions. So he would do things like send his students out to violate certain small social norms. For example, the norm of repeated questioning, right? So if I ask Katie a question, you know, it could be a completely innocuous question. Why did you drive to work today? She can give me an answer. I could maybe ask one more question. If I push beyond that point, she would very quick, well, maybe not Katie because she's kind and generous and all of that, but most people would very quickly get aggravated, right? There's a social norm that's been violated. So that's what Garfinkel would do. He would send his students, his doctoral students, out into the world to piss people off, essentially. And in that act, they would discover sort of how the norms of social order operated.
Did they get jobs?
That's a good question. Well, many of them did, actually. Many of them did, because, so to continue on, Lucy Suchman in Plans and Situated Action really builds on this same kind of sentiment and sensibility, right? This notion of breakdown being the moment at which, in this case, comes out of the work on conversational repair, but applies this to the world of technology, right? So the same sorts of things that ethnomethodologists do in the world of conversation, analyzing, turn-taking, things like that, become her entry point for reimagining the conversations that humans have with the objects around them. And again, breakdown and repair are central elements within that. My most immediate sort of touch point for all of this is a friend and former colleague and advisor of mine, Lee Starr, and Jeff Bowker, who is my PhD advisor, and the notion of infrastructure. So in articles, in a first article, some of you will be familiar with by Starr and Roulator called Steps Toward an Ecology of Infrastructure, and then developed further in a piece by Bowker and Starr called Sorting Things Out. We see this notion of infrastructure developed, one of whose, there's many other elements of it that I won't talk about, but one of the key points of that is this notion that infrastructure is invisible until breakdown, right? And that, although it's not referenced directly, is to my mind a direct inheritance of this pragmatist tradition that I've been trying to scope for you. So all of these ways, I think, are instances in which, or starting points for a theory of repair and how we might make it more central to our understanding of technology in human lives. And then there's a whole separate line, which I won't review here, which starts on the European side from Heidegger. But the piece that I particularly love, I always like to talk about, it's just a wonderful piece, is by Walter Benjamin. And this quote, actually, from an essay on Charles Baudelaire, he wrote, "Here we have a man whose job it is to gather the day's refuse in the capital, everything that the big city has thrown away, everything it has lost, everything it has scorned, everything it has crushed underfoot. He catalogues and collects. He collates the annals of intemperance, the Capharnaum of waste. He sorts things out and selects judiciously. He collects like a miser guarding a treasure, refuse which will assume the shape of useful or gratifying objects between the jaws of the goddess of industry. This description is one extended metaphor for the poetic method as Baudelaire practiced it. Rag picker and poet both are concerned with refuse." And it's fairly clear if you read on and you read other stuff into Benjamin's life that this is also where Benjamin positions himself. This is his. He regards himself as the rag picker of culture, right? He's in this recuperative mode to what he sees as the disaster of 19th century European culture crashing down around his ears, quite literally. Okay, so the world is always breaking. It's in its nature to break. This is from the Rethinking Repair essay I put up earlier. That breaking is generative and productive. It is also consequential, and many of the things we care about as information scholars turn out to be implicated in precisely such moments. And it is always being recuperated and reconstituted through repair. The question then becomes what we make of those facts and what we do next. So the next part is, so this is sort of the broad sensibility that I'm trying to bring to the world of technology. And so the next part is in part an open empirical question, which many people have been working on, I'm very happy to say. I'll talk a little bit about some other projects, but mostly I'm going to talk about 3 projects of that I've been working on to sort of get away from the theory bit and into some concrete details, all of which are quite different projects, as you'll see, but I think also flesh out, or try to flesh out some of these ideas. Okay, so the first thing I've been looking at quite a bit in the last couple of years, along with my wonderful doctoral student Leo Kang, who you'll see he'll make a cameo again, appearance later on, is amateur fixer movements generically in Europe and North America. But the particular group we've been working with primarily in an ethnographic sense is the Fixers Collective in Brooklyn. So these are all images from the Fixers Collective in Brooklyn. The Fixers Collective in Brooklyn meets typically the third Thursday of every month at an art space in Brooklyn. It actually grew out of an art exhibition from about 3 or 4 years ago. And this is what they do. They get together, people bring in, anyone can come in, bring in broken objects, and they collectively fix them. So these images are all from different things. You'll see some of the tools they typically have at their disposal. They have kind of the equivalent of a fairly well-equipped workshop, fairly well-equipped home workshop. It's nothing more advanced than that. People bring in a wide variety of objects if they would like to get fixed. The way it operates is it's not a fixing service. The idea isn't that you come in and you drop off your lamp, your laptop, your whatever to get it fixed. They want people to come in and they work together to show you how to fix it. And so that's really their mission in the world. They're part of a larger and to my mind, growing movement of similar operations around the world. So there's the Repair Cafe in Paris, there's the Fix-It Clinic and iFixit, both of which are based in California.
The Greenbelt Makerspace holds a Repair Cafe.
Fantastic. All right, I've got to add that to the...
And they have this Fixer Manifesto that they put out. I think it comes from other sources, but about, basically, you should repair the stuff instead of tossing it.
Right.
The biking community is very big into teaching repair.
Yep, that's right. The biking community is very, yeah. Well, so this is one of the manifestos. I don't know, is this the one that they use?
That might be the one.
I've seen 4 or 5 of them floating around. This one actually comes from iFixit, which is the California-based group. They're quite interesting. The iFixit's actually a company, and their business model, I mean, it's sort of a company/social movement thing, and their business model is that the thing they're most famous for, and you're most likely to encounter them in the press, is that when for example, when the new iPhone comes out, they'll do what's called a teardown, where they take apart the device. It could be any consumer electronics. They do a lot of things like phones and computers. They'll take it apart and they'll rate it, they'll give it a repairability score based on the ease with which you can take it apart, you can access the device, somebody can actually get inside and fix it. So that's what gets the most press for them. Where they make their money is they sell tools. So if you go onto iFixit, you can buy a beautiful little toolkit that has all of the screwdrivers that have been designed to unscrew the fasteners that laptop manufacturers have carefully designed so that you couldn't undo them, right? So Apple, most manufacturers have proprietary screw standards that they've developed precisely to prevent people from opening their devices. Is how iFixit would tell the story, maybe a little more complicated than that. And they publish repair manuals online. It's a very interesting site. And you can see sort of the self-proclaimed ethos behind it. So repair is better than recycling, repair saves the planet. You can see an obvious environmental sustainability tie-in. Repair saves you money. Repair teaches engineering. Repair teaches access and knowledge about technology. And this one, which I always like, if you can't fix it, you don't own it, right? So that there's this sense of an ownership right that inheres in the ability to access objects that we purchase.
Free software.
So yeah, for people who, I mean, you would, in fact, you could probably trace some of these points back to similar formulations that other kinds of technology social movements have offered at different times. And there's a few other ones. So this is the iFixit version, but if you go to the Restart project in London is another leading example, or the Repair Cafe in Paris, you would find similar kinds of things. Okay, so on any given night at the Fixers Collective, if you walked in, you would probably see something like this. You'd see people gathered around tables with a wide variety of old, often, not always old, some of them are actually fairly recent consumer products, but some of them are older, like old reel-to-reel players and things like that. You'll see them grouped around objects, so the way that it operates is they have what they call master fixers. And master fixers are people who regularly go, who have some degree of technological skill. And then they'll have general participants. Master fixers and general participants will get together around an object. They'll gather the story of the object. It's kind of like a medical diagnosis, right? So if you walk into the doctor, you describe how you've been feeling, what problems you've been encountering. People will do that for the objects they bring in. And then they'll work together to decipher it. Some of the objects they can fix based on prior experience. In many cases, they're encountering objects because they come in randomly that they can't immediately engage or fix, so then they go turn to online sources. They might call friends with particular kinds of expertise. And some things they just can't fix, right? And or some things they will look at and say, you know, the cost or the effort to fix this, they would say to the person who brought it in, here's the cost and effort to fix this. You need to make a decision about whether that's a reasonable thing to do. So it's not like they rescue every device, but they have, to my mind, a fairly remarkable success rate. They can really do a lot by pooling resources in that way. It's quite interesting. One of the things that we've been studying in this context, and actually in a Bangladeshi context, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is the forms of learning and knowledge exchange that characterize interaction and collaboration in the repair space. And it's maddeningly frustrating to read transcripts of a repair session, because what they usually say is, okay, then you like, yeah, sort of, and then kind of like, yeah, and then you do this, and there's almost no actual, there's nothing you can actually decipher from the transcript. And that's because so much of repair actually depends on this very, in this case, this form of repair, a very tactile and manual kind of knowledge. So how much do you tighten a screw? Try and describe how tight you should make or how much should you screw in a light bulb, right? It's very hard to do, right? And so a lot of it is like this. You kind of turn, try one more turn, quarter turn. You turn it until it feels kind of tight, but you don't want to strip the screw. So a lot of it has this very tactile sort of showing people how to engage and sort of feel the objects that they're working on. I should note too, one thing that comes out, you can kind of see, it's a question that people sometimes ask, and this picture reflects it well. You'll notice the age profile here, but also here. You sort of see a range here. A lot of the people actually who are in this particular case, and I haven't studied it carefully enough in enough different places to answer this definitively, but in the Brooklyn Fixers Collective, a lot of the people who are most engaged on the master fixer side are actually ex-telephone engineers. They're old AT&T guys, right? Who in most cases are retired, but in some cases they can still be active in some form, and are actually very happy to have an outlet or a place to apply their skills. And as with any social setting, there are complex internal dynamics. So there are little competitions that run between these guys, right? There are, there's a certain amount of like jockeying for prestige and skill, and part of the pleasure that is articulated, I think I might have a quote on this in a little bit, is this pleasure of demonstrating technical mastery. Like, I know all this stuff based on my history as an old Bell guy, AT&T engineer, and nobody wants to hear about it anymore. I don't have any way of deploying this. I like going to the Fixers Collective as a way of showing what I know and helping other people learn that, but also kind of appreciate my skill and knowledge in this area. So it's very complicated, like any micro-social scene, it's a very complicated one, but this is what it would look like on any given night. Okay. One of the things we've been most interested in this space is the question of values, or if you want, motivations. Why do people do this? What kinds of values do participants put in repair? So one of them is certainly around questions of skill and knowledge exchange and collaboration. It's a way of being with people through technology that people find very valuable. I mean, what else are you going to do on a Thursday night? You could be on your own, you could stay home and do this, or you could go and fix things together, right? So there's a basic kind of sociality that drives some of this. Pleasure of being part of community. There's a pleasure of being able to fix the machine and demonstration of expertise, right? So there's a puzzle-like quality to this. A lot of people who are working on this stuff I have to say, I don't share this. When I try and fix things, I get intensely frustrated. I don't appreciate the puzzle, but a lot of the people who are doing this really appreciate the puzzle, the challenge of it.
It seems a lot like software development too,
Yeah,
where you like beat your head against the wall endlessly until things finally work and then you're through.
Right, right. And there are people who take pleasure in that experience in some way. Some people who don't. Right? There's the pleasure of being able to find the error and fix things, so there's an intellectual challenge. There's a, how do I understand the logic of this machine? How can I recreate the mind of the engineer who built this thing? Why would they have done it this way? What's sort of the logical path that connects these things, which of course is also a physical path in the case of hardware. And there's a certain pleasure of restoration and or care. So some people talked in really interesting ways about the kinds of relationships with objects that stem from this kind of interaction, which is interesting because if you look at some of the things that are being fixed through an economic lens, it makes no sense, right? There's no reason to fix some of the things that are being fixed in the Fixers Collective at Brooklyn. It wasn't that expensive to begin with. It wouldn't cost very much to replace. One of the reasons you might not want to buy new and replace it could be from an environmental sensibility, but that's not the only value that's here. Some people are very, they're sort of generally positive on the environment, but that's not why they do this. For some people, it's really about building a different kind of relationship with the objects around them. So the object you fix, for some participants, is worth more than the object in its original form. Because the object you fixed encodes a social relationship, a social experience into it. It encodes some element of your labor, value you put into the device, and it therefore acquires a level of meaning that the straight, off-the-shelf kind of generic consumer product doesn't have.
Sometimes the fix also customizes it to serve your needs better too.
Right, yeah, so some of this is about that. I should say some of the, okay, so when I say repair here, the way it's practiced here, some of it is about restoration to original function, and some of it is sort of a tweak that maybe gives up on some elements of original function, but sustains the most important elements of the device, and or customizes or modifies it in some kind of a personalization way or to specific purpose. When you push in that direction, it starts to be a fuzzy line between what counts as repair and what counts as modification. And I think there are certainly some common principles that are values that apply across them. Okay, so this now is a radically different site. This is based on work with my other wonderful. All my doctoral students are wonderful. They're all, of course, I would say that, but they really are. This is with Ishtiaq Ahmed, who's been doing field work. Was doing field work last summer with the mobile phone repair markets in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So Ishtiaq is Bangladeshi. He has the language skills. He's actually a computer scientist, also retraining as an ethnographer. So it was an interesting case, which I'll talk about in a minute, sort of his own learning experience. And some of this is coming out now. There's another paper that'll be out shortly, I believe. I could certainly share if people are interested. So this is Ishtiaq. This is him working in one of his sites. What Ishtiaq did, in addition to interviews and observation at various places, he actually apprenticed as a mobile phone repair technician in one of the shops. And so this is from his apprenticeship in one of the shops in what's called the Gulistan underground market in Bangladesh. So there's a variety of repair sites that operate. Many of them are concentrated in this literally underground market. So it's a fairly crowded, extremely hot, fairly fumy kind of place under the kind of one of the main intersections and bus stations in Dhaka. It was a very interesting process because he was apprenticing in the mobile phone repair center that he was at, while also apprenticing as an ethnographer and reading Jean Lave's Apprenticeship in Critical Ethnographic Practice, which is really a beautiful book, which I encourage to people. These are some of the results that come out. So there's a few different sectors to what's sort of the broader repair ecologies that constitute mobile phone repair in this case in Dhaka. We have, on the more formal end, we have things like this. This is actually the center that he apprenticed at, which are semi-formal training institutes. People will go there for 6 weeks, and they will acquire certain basic skills in phone repair, but they also do other kinds of electronics. Ronnie is one of the workers mobile phone workers that are operating in the Gulistan underground market. And then another side of this, which to my mind is very interesting and quite reminiscent actually of the Benjamin quote I put up earlier, there's a class of workers, people in Bangladesh called the Vangari, which translates literally to broken people. And what they are the people who circulate through the city and effectively redistribute waste back into various kinds of productive uses. So the Vangari will go around to, for example, some of the mobile phone repair centers. They'll collect broken motherboards, broken parts, and then they'll resell them to people who might need them. The things that they can't resell, they sell by the pound to recyclers in a warehouse that then disappears into this black hole, but the story is that they go back to be melted down in China. But at that point, things become somewhat dicey because that's technically not supposed to be happening, although we're 99% sure that that's actually exactly what's happening most of the time. Okay, so if you think about the broader repair worlds that constitute this kind of activity in Bangladesh, you have, so this is your user. This is who we usually think about when we think about technology. If we're not talking about designers, we're usually talking about users. But there are these wider varieties or wider classes of people who actually are central to the ongoing operation of technology in the world, including the user experience. So if you're a user, you can bring your phone to one of these different repair technicians. There is what's called a brand repair world, which is the repair centers that any of the major, so the Samsung Repair Center, for example. What's interesting in Bangladesh, at least, is that they actually do almost no real repair. What they do is replacement, and then anything that comes into them that they're not junking, they immediately sell back or get consultations or refer back to the informal market. So the informal market people, and it's an odd situation because this is where if you have higher credentials and an engineering degree, you might get a job at the Samsung Center or the Nokia Center here, which tends to pay more money, which tends to have higher prestige, which actually involves very little real skill, because you're really just kind of a transit point for the company. So the informal repairers take great pride in the fact, every time the brand repairers, who are these sort of more socially prestigious people, come to them with a broken phone, they take great pride in the fact that they need to come to us to get it fixed. But that really is how it works. And then this is the sort of the end of the chain, or the end of one part of the chain, for things that aren't getting taken back up through this repair world, e-waste recycling in China. All right, so there's a variety of forms of learning that go on that we've spent some time writing about. A lot of the learning is organized through apprenticeship. That's really the dominant form of learning here. That seems to be the dominant form of learning in other people who have worked on mobile phone repair in other locations. So there's a great student, actually she was a student of Lucy Suchman's, named Lara Houston from Lancaster University. She's just written a beautiful dissertation on mobile phone repair in Kampala. I'm here in town for the American Anthropological Association meeting, which is happening now, and yesterday there was a panel all about repair, and there were other people doing repair in different sites, and it's remarkable how common some of these patterns seem to be across quite different geographic locations.
Could you just repeat her name? Sorry.
Lara Houston. Houston like the city, and then Lara just L-A-R-A. So there are formal elements of learning. There are semi-formal institutions. There are polytechnic institutes which teach engineering but not repair. They teach engineering in the schematic, Western copied kind of version for the most part. Books and manuals are jealously guarded within the repair community. Schematics are gold. Paper schematics, if people have paper manuals of particular brands, particular phone brands, those are shared sort of strategically within the community. They're not given out lightly. Some people make use of online resources. This was actually a place that there was a real distinction between what we saw happening in Bangladesh and Lara saw happening in Uganda. And that's partly about a slightly different socioeconomic level of the people involved and partly a language story. So there are online resources. There's something called the GSM Forum for mobile phone repair, which is sort of this worldwide discussion board for mobile phone repair technicians. Most of the technicians we talked to in Bangladesh were effectively cut out from that for language reasons and or internet access reasons. The costs of getting online were just too high. So this is kind of, let me see if I've got this. This will just give you a flavor for what this. This is in the Gulistan underground market. So if you walked in, it would look something like this. You'd see people kind of pouring over. This would be the master, sort of the main fixer. These are probably apprentices that are kind of watching him as he operates. Customers typically are not allowed to watch as they operate because they actually don't want unlike the iFixit people, they don't want customers to fix their own phones. I don't have a bigger pan, I guess, on the wider market. So that's the second case I want you to keep in mind. And then this is the last case, and it's really quite different. This comes out of the same general interest and inspiration, but we're particularly interested in exploring the linkage between breakdown repair and creativity or innovation, and the question of whether we could retell the story of innovation so that it wasn't so design-centered, but could actually take better account of forms of creative human engagement with technology, also embedded in acts of maintenance and repair. So what we did is we went out, this is with my other student I mentioned, Leo Kang, who's an artist as well as being a software engineer. And we went out and did a series of interviews with mostly new media and interactive artists in the US and Europe who engaged the criteria we used, people who engage technological breakdown and repair as a topic or method of work. We interviewed about 25 artists. These are some of those artists, some of the work they did. So this is from a guy who sort of creates clocks out of old industrial machinery. This is a guy, Paulo Goldstein in London, who repurposes old things and makes these really funky furniture bits. This one is actually from an artist named Tezu Park, who turned out and went on to become a collaborator of artists. So coming out of the interviews, there were a lot of synergies between what he was his series here is called Digital Being, and it's got this sense that there are lives to the objects around us that we don't take account of. It's sort of the rough tagline a lot of his work. Partly based on the interview, we talked more with him. I'll say more about that in a minute. We interviewed artists, a number of dumps and recycling facilities. More and more recycling facilities in the US have artist in residence programs. I don't know if Maryland does, but there's some in California, New York City has one. Actually, Tezu is now just recently started as the artist in residence at the Lower East Side Recycling Center in New York. So we interviewed people involved in programs like that. And based on that, so part of the work we did there was an interview set with people to account for the forms of value and creativity that they saw, why they engaged with broken technologies, what they got out of that encounter. And then we decided to engage, to build a collaborative project of our own. So this is Leo here, the doctoral student I mentioned. I like to tell, this is the scale that's at the center of the project. And the reason, so the title of the project, Scale, people assume it's like this social science theory, like, oh, there are multiple scales of analysis. But it's only called Scale because the first object that we found that was focal point for it happened to be a bathroom scale. All right, so that's the bathroom scale that started it. This is at the Ithaca Reuse It Center, which we did some collecting from. We also did some street collecting. This is some of the objects that came back to Leo's garage/studio. This is inside Leo's garage/studio, and this is what we eventually came up with. It's an art installation that we showed at the World Maker Fair last year, not this fall, but the last fall. It showed in a gallery in Ithaca for a few weeks in the winter, and then it was at the Computer Human Interaction CAI Interactivity Conference in Toronto in the spring. I think I've got a, so this is us. This is, that's Tezu there, that's me. This is actually my daughter, who was not very involved but wanted to be in the picture. That's Leo at the back. So this is what the object, the installation looked like from one angle. This was in the World Maker Faire instantiation. But I'll show you this as a better way of seeing it. So it's dark when you walk in. The scale is the trigger point for the installation. All right, so that, those of you who sort of know this world, it's interesting, Leo and Tezu are both Korean, and you might see little bits of Namjoon Paik sort of influence in there, the famous Korean new media artist. So one of the most interesting things that we have shown this thing in many places. We've conducted formal and informal interviews with people walking out of the installation in many instances. If you include the informal ones, it's hundreds. There were many thousands of people who went through at the World Maker Faire. It was quite busy. And it was interesting to see the reaction of the people who came in. One of the interesting things that we were after is the possibility of surprise that might come out of this kind of encounter, the kinds of affective relationships people might, or affective reactions people might have to this. It was interesting to watch people. So first of all, one of the things we hadn't encountered was that the scale is a more loaded cultural device. And it's interesting, see, this is exactly right. All the women in the room know immediately what I'm saying, and the guys are like, what? And we were all guys, so of course we missed this, we screwed this up. It was interesting to watch people step on it, and people had all these theories about how it worked, many of which were not actually how it worked. The scale was a simple on button. It was a very simple trigger point. But many people were, first of all, concerned that if they stepped on it, their weight would be flashed on all these screens. People had theories that if you were heavier, that it would cause certain kinds of reactions, and if you were lighter, it would cause other kinds of reactions. So there was an interesting, people were kind of puzzle out how it actually, sort of at a functional level, how it operated. A lot of, sort of in keeping with the AT&T retired engineer point earlier, we had a lot of older people in particular come along, and the technologies that included were sort of all the way through the 20th century. So we had stuff really, some of it was probably, the oldest was probably like very early 20th century. We would have people kind of standing there and having kind of a nostalgia trip back in time, sort of thinking, well, I used to use that, or I still have one of those in my basement, or what have you done with that? Young kids would come on, they wouldn't know what any of the technologies were, and then their parents would be like, oh, well, that's called a reel-to-reel player. That's what they used to play movies on, at one point in time. The broader interest that comes out of the artist interview set, and that we then experienced in part in our activities, was this idea of the possibility of a collaborative relationship with objects, and whether you could imagine a form of creativity and innovation that was actually a form of partnership or almost a conversation with those objects that evolved over time, rather than a priori design model, which is how I think we often tend to conceptualize the process of creativity and innovation. I think there are two errors we often make. One is the in-the-head model, that creativity is something that lives in the 3, 5, 6 centimeters between here and here, as opposed to creativity being a relationship that we build with each other and with the world, including the world of objects. And the other is this, what Tim Ingold actually calls the hylomorphic model, that the moment of creativity is about the imposition of form on the world. Like the act of creativity is about me having a design in my head and then putting it on the world, as opposed to something in which the ideas in my head and the form in the world are actually in some sort of a collaboration or a discussion. So this is kind of the edge of what we're trying to get at with the notion of repair and creativity here. Okay, so to wrap things up and draw some things together, maybe a little bit. One thing to note, obviously, is the huge range of these experiences. So these are radically different sites, they're radically different social worlds. The notions of repair, the forms of repair being practiced in each of these sites are really quite different. The stakes are quite different, the social organization is quite different. The people getting together over coffee Thursday nights in Brooklyn is quite different than the forms of livelihood repair that constitute the experiences we talked about in Bangladesh. And also that the social organization of repair is quite different. So one of the things that begins to emerge across multiple sites is that the way in which we organize repair around technology actually shows vastly more diversity than the way we organize production around technology. So there's a line, the opening line actually, I may have said this to some of you before in talks because I always love this line, but the opening line of Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way, is a really great story, I think, for repair. So all functioning devices are the same, all broken devices are broken in their own way. So there's a story about diversity in repair that I think is quite interesting to pull out. There's a story about repair, creativity, and innovation, which I've tried to sketch, and in particular the need to reorient our stories of creativity and innovation to account for a broader range of technological practices, which include maintenance and repair. There's a remarkable skill involved in this, so I haven't talked about it today, but there are some procedures we describe that the Bangladeshi repair technicians are performing that are quite stunning, quite amazing. They blow people away. If you show them to Western engineers, they're quite shocked at this. There's a story of power and invisibility. So there's a differential distribution of power. Under dominant conceptions of technology, processes of breakdown and repair tend to fall away, and we tend to recenter on moments of design and adoption. But what we want to say is that these moments of maintenance and repair are part of the longer durée of human relationships with technology, and we erase them at our peril. And there's a story of value, so the kinds of social and also actually economic value being built, maintained, and restored through repair. So these are all themes that we bring out of the work. To bring this out to a wider level, there's some of the work explores a broader a version of what we call the others have also called the post-humanist proposition, which we boil down to 3 general points. This is really the ethics, if you want, of repair. Humans aren't alone in the ethical universe, but rather participate in more and less responsible ways with the world of animate and inanimate things. That much of what we regard as essentially human is constituted in this encounter, and that there exist autonomous realms of value and meaning beyond our capacity and interest to engage, which I could talk about that last point a little bit more at the end if we're interested. There's some wider themes that we're drawing on in political philosophy. This is kind of the next wave of the work. So Judith Butler has done a lot of work on precariousness as a ground for human ethics, and we're trying to argue that notions of precariousness may also be a way of thinking through human relationships to technology that would account for acts of maintenance and repair more effectively. So from this standpoint, to be human is to be exposed, this is Butler's point, to be human is to be exposed to the ever-present threat and experience of loss. And she also makes the point that precariousness and vulnerability are differentially distributed. We're hoping to pour some of that into the world of technology. There's also really nice work, sort of in the same general vein, by William Connolly on the fragility of things, which reminds us that fragility is in part an engineered condition in the world. That vulnerability, if earlier on I spoke about the tendency of things to fall apart as being this sort of generic thing that happens in the world, a generic way of thinking about how objects operate in the world, Connolly reminds us that fragility is also socially organized, right? That fragility is distributed along certain lines. There's a great line from Zimmel, which is to this point, about how fragility regularly gets passed down to the lowest common denominator, and to be low in the pecking order in any society is to be the person who's most exposed to the vagaries of change and vulnerability. Okay, so to wrap things up, we argue that attending to maintenance and repair opens up new empirical landscapes that are central to the reality, if not yet the theory, of human-computer interaction and information science more generally. We argue that what we learn from this encounter can help us with other core problems that information science routinely faces around design, creativity, sustainability, and justice, for example. And that attending to breakdown, maintenance, and repair can help us towards a new post-humanist, or you don't have to use that word if you don't like it, an ethics or politics of care with technology, which can help ground new modes of ethical attachment and responsibility to the object worlds around us and to each other. And that's it.
I'm game. Thank you very much, Mr. Brockton. You started with this very ambitious vision about collapsing cities and rivers and so on, but then went, I thought, narrower to devices.
Yep.
And, I mean, isn't there a whole repair culture of the open source movement? Bugzilla, reporting bugs, and I mean, that's a technical one, but there's also people who attempt to repair organizations. You mentioned at the end sustainability and justice, but there are more ambitious, templates for enacting repair that I think, would amplify the potency of what you're saying here. I mean, you've got it, today's New York Times, by the way, if you didn't see it in this morning's paper. I did notice it.
Oh, that's great.
But here's a whole story about fixing stuff and repairing the world as art and as things. But I do think...
Who's the... Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, this one was about repairing environments that have landmines in them. So here's an artistic piece that actually finds and destroys landmines. So I'm looking to amplify and raise the notion you offered us to go back to your opening slides and fulfill the vision that says this is potent stuff.
So I agree, and I'm completely open to that. I think it's an open space. I think the general vision is quite ambitious and open-ended, and the particular empirical examples we've been filling out are small chunks within that wider space. So we are very interested. Actually, the panel, the panel I was on yesterday was all about repair and anthropology. So how can maintenance and repair change how we do anthropology? And some of the examples were kind of similar to what I was talking about here, like with the examples of mobile phone fixers in Dhaka. But other people were more at that level, like how do we apply notions of maintenance and repair to how we think about organizations? Because I do think it's environments. It's absolutely, there was somebody who was talking about that in the ecological sense.
So what are the lessons from your deep study on these repair communities that would amplify and allow us to scale, in my word, scale repair to these, larger challenges?
So I think one of the lessons is questions around, so I didn't talk a lot about the ethics of care in this particular presentation, but I think notions of care are actually central first of all, they're present around things where we might not normally expect to see them, right? We see there's actually an ethics of care that goes into potentially into the maintenance of things that are pretty generic and consumerist and stuff that we wouldn't expect to find care in. In some sense, computers and cell phones are the hard case for care. I think the environment is the easier case for care. But pointing out how care operates, even within spaces that we've typically regarded as narrowly technical or functional, I think offers additional force to people who want to make arguments for care and an ethics of care in relationship to things like environments. Because it's easy to love a tree, it's somewhat harder to love a laptop, but in fact we can do both. Right? It's kind of the two strong.
Could you just suggest how what you're saying relates to Bill Tomlinson's Collapse Informatics?
So it's, I would say the version, it's a really good question, and I like Tomlinson's work a lot. My sense of collapse informatics is that it's about designing objects for a future major sort of societal collapse. And a lot of what we care about is actually more humble and mundane and ongoing. Right? It's about how we actually, not what do we do after the disaster, but what are we always doing that actually keeps things going on a day-to-day basis. But I don't think they're contradictory. I think of them as complementary programs. Yeah.
So Steve, there's a whole world of preservation in archival and museum and library community, right? Where it's all about sustaining the artifact, and we created certain terminologies to guide us in doing this, like significant properties, and I wonder how your research, because you mentioned the implication of your project to design and creativity, like things that the high school seem to cover, but not the preservation community. Is that the specific labs that you?
So it's a great question. I don't. I think if I knew more about preservation, I'd be more able to kind of make that translation. I mean, I think it's like the sentiment is like-minded. I think, and I know that a bunch of I've talked to many preservationists who when they read this one essay, they sort of see like a nice consonance with kind of the ethos of preservation. I mean, I think it probably speaks to what I think this would do is probably speak to the ongoing labor of preservation. It would call out the ongoing acts of maintenance and repair. In its interest in the generativity of repair, it might challenge going back or sticking with an original form of restoration, because I think that part of what we want to bring out here in repair is not necessarily only a return to original function, but how that's actually sort of an ongoing iterative process by which continuity is maintained in the world, but not without change.
But the world of digital preservation, for instance, I don't think we want to go back to the original. Sometimes it's almost impossible. That's why you have to identify key elements that could be present, but you cannot capture everything in its original. So there's really deep resonance to the preservation world that I'm not pushing you to do it, but maybe there's another archivist in this room could do it.
I'd like to talk more about this actually, because I think there's a lot that we could learn from preservation that it hasn't yet learned from preservation. So that'd be a really rich connection.
Actually, I mean, I think this is a really valuable message for that community. It seems to me from from what I've read in the conversations I've been a part of, that digital preservation has sort of backed itself into this corner whereby there's a real kind of phobia and anxiety around the artifact as such, and the notion that the computer is something that one keeps, one preserves. It's all about moving things away from the original hardware and imposing as many layers of abstraction as possible. But that seems to me to be a kind of self-inflicted wound, right? And I think this is a kind of counterpoint to that mode of thinking. It's a way of demonstrating what's at stake from this reparative or materialist standpoint.
I'm interested in the motivations for doing repair, and of course there are many, but two that I'm thinking about that I think you didn't mention, that I think are quite interesting. I mean, one you implicitly mentioned, which is reputation.
Mm-hmm.
I was brought up by an uncle who repaired everything from cars to toasters to broken spoons for the whole neighborhood. The only thing he ever got from it was, thank you, Bill, and meet me in the pub and I'll buy you a beer,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So the reputation, and I presume that, I mean, he just would not give up. I mean, he believed he could mend anything, and he did. So I think reputation is perhaps a word that should be there. But I think possibly the more interesting one is repair in relation to economic models. I mean, you, on your Bangladesh example, there's definitely an economic model of making money through the repair. Now, I wish we could somehow use that in some other societies where we don't repair, we replace. Again, I'm thinking particularly of cars, you know, a light bulb goes and a whole unit or something is replaced.
Right.
So how do we kind of make the changes to support the environment and provide viable economic models to the people who make the whole unit,
Right.
and therefore don't want repair?
Right,
you
right.
know?
So that's a great question, and it's certainly not one that we've answered yet, but it's one we're very interested in. And I mean, so there's the economies that support it. There's the question about what can we learn from repair to bring back and reform the styles of design we engage in, which could include that question about, you know, modularity, replaceability. We've
Well, you've got strong political forces and economic forces going against it in some places.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We're actually, there's a next stage to this, which we're working on now. We've just gotten a grant from the NSF, Daniela Rosner, University of Washington, and myself, and Laura Houston actually is going to be a postdoc on that grant, which is trying to bridge back from repair to design. So we've got, we're going to be working with Intel and Microsoft, and who are confirmed, and there's one other company we're working on, which will actually bring together the hardware and software designers from those firms, also people in the corporate social responsibility kind of environmental wings of those firms, together with some of the amateur fixers in collective fixing workshops, which will be starting. Those will be starting next. The first one will happen next fall in New York, I think, and there's going to be one in London, and there's going to be one on the West Coast, but we don't know exactly when they're scheduled yet. So we don't know the answer to that yet, but we do hope that that one of the next steps is to bring some of that sentiment and sensibility back to that work of design. Even before then, there are some fairly low, some fairly obvious barriers that could be overcome with a little bit of effort that might help support some of this fixability things. So one of the things that currently, there's a few different things that limit fixability in the current form, and one is a design thing. One is simple things like documentation and the circulation of repair manuals. So for a while, a number of firms have been pretty nasty about repair manuals, and they've been using intellectual property and copyright to crack down on groups that are trying to circulate repair manuals to wider sets of people. And it's uncertain why. One of the reasons, I think, is to channel people into this, into brand repair, their own repair operations. One of them is a sort of classic engineering fear that those moron users will just screw it up if we let them into the device. So I think that there are things that people have been working, like iFixit has been working on this a lot. Some of the amateur fixer groups, in addition to running workshops, have a little bit of a, it's nothing as official as a lot. I mean, they're way too small to be lobbyists, but they try and do a little bit of social movement activism to kind of support those things. So I do think that there are ways in which, even without sort of disrupting the core economic models, you could support this kind of activity to make it a little bit easier. Some of that's happening already. So I mentioned GSM Forum. iFixit is kind of an online response. Some of its activities are really oriented to that goal. But there's a broader story about how we organize economic production in general, which is a much larger problem than this can solve, but this is a kind of a starting point for questioning it, at least.
Probably the last question.
Okay.
Just quickly, can you talk a little bit more about the e-waste issue? And isn't there an international convention on this issue? And I mean, are you involved in that side of it at all? Or
I'm not as involved in that side of it. I talk with people who are working much more actively on that. There are conventions, and they're working towards sort of heightened, sort of stricter conventions. In the places that we've, like in Bangladesh, I'm actually not sure if Bangladesh is a signatory to those conventions, but in any case, it seems quite clear that if there's a convention in place, it's not being recognized, or it's being skirted by export. It's being skirted by people buying e-waste by the they literally buy it by the pound. So if you're a Bangadi, you collect the motherboards and you sell them by the pound to the recyclers. So I have not been as involved in that side of it, but I think it's an important addendum.
Thank you, Stephen, for